It's go time.
Welcome to Quick Kicks here on Third Down Gamble with your host, Don Charbin, and special guest, Dave Thomas. 620 CKRM, radio play-by-play voice of the Saskatchewan Roughriders.
Welcome to Quick Kicks, everyone. I'm Don Charbin, and today Dave Thomas, 620 CKRM, the voice of the Saskatchewan Roughriders, is with me, and I'm so happy to have him on the podcast. Dave, welcome, and how is everything going for you today down in Regina?
Well, it's not as cold as it could have been. It's still a little bit snowy, but I guess cold is par for the course. Being a Saskatchewanian, I know all about this stuff. We're good.
Well, if you live in Saskatchewan, you've got basically 2 weather days. It's either winter or summer.
Yeah. In a nutshell, and if you don't like it, wait 5 minutes. It'll change. Trust us.
If we could believe in that, yes, I'd love to go for it. Now, let's get talking about you. And you're I take it, a native Saskatchewan kid. You grew up in this province, correct?
Yeah, I actually was born and raised in Weyburn, so that's about an hour and 10 minutes. I guess it depends who's driving, right? So about 110 kilometers or so southeast of Regina. So that was where I grew up, and that's where I spent most of my childhood. Of course, I was split with the family farm, which was just outside a place called Kayville, Saskatchewan. We were 12 minutes away from the village of Kayville. It's down around Avonlea. It's kind of south of Moose Jaw. So that was kind of where I spent most of my childhood, terrorizing family members and friends growing up.
And that's the way to be. If you've got open spaces, you may as well use them.
Exactly. And I did that very well, I'll have you know.
I know from my own experience, growing up on a farm, anytime I could be outside and doing something, that was where I was.
Yeah, and for better or for worse, depending on who you asked, right?
Exactly. Yeah, on the day, I could be rewarded. On the day, I could be in detention.
Yeah, that's very true. But it's one of those things that it's funny because I think that growing up on the prairies, like I find myself that I get claustrophobic quite easily. Like, and again, it's not to the point where, okay, I can't board an aircraft or anything. But again, if I don't see the sky for a certain amount of time, I find that really weird in my own little world. So yeah, I think that has a part of it is just being able to have that wide open freedom that we enjoy in the prairies.
It sort of reminds me of the song, I think, Dog Ran Away and It Took 3 Days. On the prairies, it will do that. But I'm with you on that. I've got a family in Kelowna, and this idea of mountains in my way all the time, it just drives me nuts.
Well, and it's funny, my wife is from Vancouver, and I don't know, maybe her family was having fun with me or not, but I would always get turned around and like misdirections. And again, Google Maps and everything are fine, but if you still don't know what direction you're going, sometimes as a prairie kid, you get lost all the time. It wasn't until they told me, like, you're thinking too hard about this. The mountains are not on the east like you are anticipating. They're on the north. And that changed my entire perspective and outlook about, well, not the in-laws. The in-laws have always been great, but about going to visit them.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, you grew up in southern Saskatchewan. What was your school life like? What impressed you about it? What did you do to have fun?
Well, back in the day, boy, I tell you, there was a whole myriad of things that I did that you would probably be absolutely flabbergasted to know. Like, my dad was born and raised in London, England. And to say that he had absolutely zero time for hockey or football would probably be an understatement. He was a soccer guy through and through, and he actually started up minor soccer in Weyburn. And so this was just after he had immigrated to Canada and long before I was born, but he would spend his Sundays out mowing the field with a little push mower for the soccer teams in town. So that was what he did. So of course I grew up in and around that competitive environment, playing soccer for the most part growing up. But also on my mom's side, my grandmother was straight from Scotland. She was a war bride. There's a lot of things that are rooted in England and Scotland and Great Britain. So I learned how to play the bagpipes as a kid. I became the drummer in the band as a kid, which actually wasn't cool until it translated into me getting my own drum kit at home, which I thought was pretty neat. So I did those kinds of things, but there was a lot of soccer in my upbringing. Is again, you can imagine with dad having the passion that he did for the sport, I played just a ton of it growing up.
The soccer side of things, how far did you go with that? Did the team do well, etc.?
Well, I don't know that we did real well, but by process of elimination, when you're playing in a smaller community, right, you get some advantages that you wouldn't have if you played in Regina. So, for example, our team qualified to play in the summer games. We did that the one year. We were in the smaller provincial championship bracket. So we had some success on the provincial level. And then, like I said, probably my dad would tell you the biggest one was what was it? The Melfort Summer Games. I think it was 96, something like that. But that was where we won the first games for our zone ever at this championship. And it all came down to a penalty shot. And it was a situation where in penalty kicks. And so you always have to, it was when your dad's the coach, right? You kind of understand that there's a balancing act, right? Because he believes in you, but also he knows that there could be other guys that are well suited. So I believe I was our fifth shooter and we were tied going in. So we're now in sudden death kicks. And I remember his words of advice to me going up, just make him make a save. So you hit the net, it's likely going to go in. And I remember I just wound up and I booted it out onto the street because it was so high over top of the net. So yeah, that was my soccer career in a nutshell right there.
I'm sure a lot of people have the same story. It's it can be a very humbling game when it comes to penalty kicks.
Absolutely. And yeah, I was showing right there that I wasn't suited well for the mental component of the game, nor was I suited well for the physical aspect either, apparently.
Now, okay, so did that carry you right through high school? Did other sports start to come into the fore, hockey, football, etc.?
Yeah, no, other sports actually, to the disappointment of my dad, started to come in because just the way that the fledgling program was, right? They didn't have the carryover into the older age group. I think we aged out around under 12 or under 14 or something like that. The soccer ended. That was it. That was all. So we had to find other passions. So again, there was hockey that was always going on. And for me, there was football. I loved football. I wasn't the biggest fan of the physicality of the sport. I was more intrigued of the nuts and bolts and the chess match that is the game of football. And that kind of led me into being, again, I was small. I was extremely small in high school. So I was a defensive back. And you look at my stats. Yeah, okay. I set and again, this is going to sound so Al Bundy-ish. I set a record for interceptions in the Regina League. And, you know, those numbers look great on paper and you get some looks, you get some calls and stuff like that. If you go inside those numbers, I was the worst player ever. I would not play defense the way we're supposed to. I was simply flowing to the football, reading where that quarterback was going to deliver the football. And again, if you look at it, I am out of position so many times that it was terrible. It was so bad that I thought I was good, to be completely honest. The number of times that I'd have to do the shoulder check because somebody's running by me was incredible. But again, that was when I started. I didn't appreciate it at the time, but that was really when I started falling in love. And then I had teammates, of course, that went on to play for the Huskies. And I think a few of them went on to play for the Rams as well back in the day. So it was that was kind of where I was introduced to football. My passion for the sport began to grow, in addition to hockey as well. Of course, the Weyburn Red Wings were a huge thing in our community growing up, just what they did in the school. And I was never, ever, ever, ever talented enough to ever be considered or qualified for that type of caliber of play. But boy, they really captured your imagination. And so those were the kind of the two things that you started to gravitate towards, or at least I did in the high school era of Dave Thomas.
Weyburn, of course, being in the Saskatchewan Junior Hockey League, which is, I don't know how it compares to the WHL. Is it on par, a step below?
The two leagues have kind of really changed in the fact that for the Western Hockey League, there's a lot of athletes that are pursuing a professional career. At the time in the Saskatchewan Junior Hockey League, it was players were pursuing a post-secondary education and getting looks and eyes to try to play south of the border in the NCAA. It has changed a little bit as the SJHL athletes are maybe one of those that are less mature in the fact I'm not talking about their mentality or anything, just their bodies haven't physically developed, right? They're younger players a lot of times. So that's kind of the difference between the two leagues. Back in the day when in 1984, and again, I was so young in 1984. It's incredible that I even remember it, but that was the defining moment for our community, was when they won what was then the Centennial Cup in 1984. Everybody in town had a moment of where they were, from kids that somehow were able to jump onto the ice and steal the sticks from the players that threw them all into the goal while they were celebrating. I don't know who that would be, but to the casual person that was out in the parking lot because the fire official really came into the building and actually booted some people out because they were stacked to the rafters, right? That was the era. And we were fortunate enough to live on, which is actually when my broadcasting career would start to develop about a decade later, when just there was an opportunity that presented itself to help out with the broadcasts. And next thing you know, I'm helping out doing games in the Saskatchewan Junior Hockey League for 3 years for the Weyburn Red Wings. So that's kind of where it all grew and developed there.
Well, for people who are not familiar, the Centennial Cup, that was the championship for all of Canada for all the provincial junior leagues.
Yeah, absolutely. So they played oh boy, it's going to bug me. I'm going to have people that are texting me after this. They played an Ontario team in the final, and it was incredible because the Centennial Cup became the Royal Bank Cup, which now is just the national championship, which is kind of a mimic of the Memorial Cup tournament, if you will, right? Because it's most economically feasible. You bring in the teams from all the territories, the qualifiers from across the country. Back then, it truly was, you would play best of 7. So you had to beat the Manitoba champs. Then you had to beat the Alberta BC champs. Then you had to beat whoever won the East, which was an Ontario team. And again, like I said, it was just incredible times in hockey, and the fact that you're playing best of 7s, like nobody had the budget for these back then, but then again, who cared as long as you're bringing the communities together, which is what it was all about.
Now, you mentioned that 10 years later you're into radio and covering the Red Wings. How did that transpire? How did that come about?
Fluke, kind of, to be totally honest. Fluke. I had no idea that I wanted to get into broadcasting. I had no idea what I wanted to do when I was done in high school. It was kind of my parents that said, you should pursue a degree, at least have something that you can lay your head back on. So I started looking at that, and I attended some classes, and I started to do some things, and it wasn't my thing. Realizing that, I kind of started picking up other jobs. And what it was, back in the day, I was working at McDonald's. And McDonald's, they have the new McArch Deluxe Burger out, but they had introduced it back then when I was working at it. And the owner needed someone that he thought had a good voice. And he said, you sound pretty good when you're doing drive-through. Let's send you down to the radio station and you can make the announcement for the launch of this new burger. So they were kind enough. They took me in, they showed me around, and I'm like, this is what I've got to be doing. Like, I enjoy the marketing aspect of business, which is what I was taking, but this is what I've got to be doing. This is broadcasting. I got hired to do, first of all, behind the scenes, and then an opening came up on the broadcast the following season, and I'm doing color for the next 3 years in the Saskatchewan Junior Hockey League, thinking that it's pretty cool, which after that then actually turned into a 10-year career with the Saskatoon Blades.
That's a bit of a jump because it takes you away from home for one thing. And, of course, it's a major market, the Saskatoon area.
Absolutely, for sure. And it's funny, I wasn't even hired to be a part of the Western Hockey League broadcast. When I was hired to do an afternoon show. It just so happened that 5 days before the season started, the guy that was going to be doing color commentary for the Blades, he left the position. They couldn't do it anymore. And Les Lazaruk, who's been the longtime voice of the Blades for 30 plus years, came up to me and he goes, I heard when you were hired that like you've done some hockey before. I'm like, yeah, I did color for 3 years. I got 150 games or something like that in the SJHL. He goes, no way. He goes, well, you're the new color guy for the Blades. And I'm like, whoa. I got to check with my boss because that means I'm leaving early from my shift and stuff. And little did I know till years later that the two of them were colluding, trying to find a way that they could pay me some more money. They said, hey, this is going to be right up his alley. So that's exactly what I did. And I did it for 10 years, riding the bus here and there. And I would never have ever imagined the opportunity coming to me. And like I said, they both just kind of fell into my lap, perfect timing. And with the Blades, it was anything less. It's basically anything you want to do. I want to make sure that I'm here to help you do that and learn that. And I got an opportunity to do it. And it was interesting because I guess my 7th season in, we had our first child. And Lauren Mulliken, who was the general manager and head coach of the Blades at the time, looked at me on the bus because we were taking a trip to Prince Albert, I believe it was. And he says, well, congratulations on your child. And he made the obligatory, he'll be a Bantam draft pick in X year. And then he said, well, I guess we'll lose you in about 3-4 years. And I'm like, what are you talking about? This is the best job ever. I'm not going anywhere. And he looked at me right in the eye and he said, there's going to be a point where you're going to watch your kid play than when you want to watch somebody else's kid play. And sure enough, 3 years later, I was coaching a hockey team as opposed to broadcasting one.
How big a decision was that to take, and what did that mean for your career?
Again, timing is everything. So at that point, the WHL on Shaw broadcast was just launching and just becoming a thing, right? And boy, I tell you, there was a lot of talented people that took that production to the next level. And they had kind of approached me about doing games that were in the East because they had a great West crew with Dan Russell and Bill Wilms. They said, in the East, though, we need some guys. And we understand that you're not kind of doing as much as you were doing on the radio before. Would you be interested in looking at the television option? Looking at the television option, as opposed to 72 games, you're maybe looking at 18 through the regular season. It was the best of both worlds in that I could still pursue my career, still continue to do what I love, which is broadcasting hockey. I was still daily on the radio in Saskatoon. And then now I've just had the opportunity to add on to that, the opportunity where I was actually going to also do some television broadcasts, which I did.
And just a little nugget, I'm a precursor to that Shaw business where I used to do the games. They were called telecable at the time, and we used to do games. I think I did it for about 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Isn't it? It's like it's such a small world. Like, now I'll run it. Hey, remember I ran the camera for you that game? I'm like, oh, yeah, I do. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, right? Like, I kind of do it, but it was such a small world. But again, the amount of fun and opportunity that allowed broadcasters just to craft their trade, right? Whether it was in front of the camera or behind the camera, it was sensational. And if you go back and you look at some of those early games that I did, like you're scratching your head, like, who is this guy? And probably there's people to this day going, who is this guy? But back then it was really like, wow, this guy's got a lot to learn. And fortunately enough, I had the opportunity to do that.
Well, the one thing about radio that I always will believe is that radio gives you opportunities to do that crafting, because nobody else is watching the game with you unless they've got a headset and they're in the stadium.
Absolutely. That is one of the harsh truths of it all. But as time has evolved, there are more and more people that are watching what you're saying, if you know what I mean, even on radio. And so you can't get away with it. Back in the early days in the SJHL, right? I won't name the name, but there was someone that came up to us and just, hey, you remember that no one on the home team ever loses a fight on the radio, right? I'm like, okay, I now know that. So again, right? So we're not making it up all the time, folks. But yes, it had been known to happen where there were some things that were said and done on the radio back in the day just to fuel ticket sales and stuff like that were back way before you could get called on it. And now you would in a heartbeat.
With Shaw, how long did you do that for?
Oh, I think we were doing it for 5 or 6 years was kind of the way things were going. And again, like I say, it was every opportunity. And then it became a situation where it was more that they needed more from me that I could offer. And the fact that I was bumped up to doing a morning show in Saskatoon. So when you're getting at home at 2:00 in the morning from Moose Jaw after broadcasting a game and then having to get up at 4 to go back to work, it was becoming a challenge. It was about 5-6 years that we were doing it as a whole. And then I moved into some other roles within the broadcast, just filling in when they needed. But it was definitely a golden time for sure. We'd go to a game in Moose Jaw or Swift Current or Prince Albert or wherever the case may be, because we're starting to do more midweek games as opposed to weekend games. And so with that came that I should be actually on the air the next morning in Saskatoon.
Getting up with 2 hours of sleep and doing that.
Yeah, it was a challenge. There were some days where you're like, oh my gosh. But yeah, you just had to manage it is what I kept telling people.
We're getting closer and closer and closer to the time that you become part of the Roughriders. What about that gap? After Shaw, you've got your morning show. How does this develop yet?
Well, what happened then at kind of the same time as I was starting to step back from hockey is that our radio station acquired the rights for the Saskatoon Hilltops. So I started doing Hilltop broadcasts in addition to the Blades. So when I said, okay, listen, I need to take a break from doing the Blades hockey, they said, well, you know what? We really like what you're doing for football. Can you still do that? So I still did Hilltop football games in conjunction with Shaw. So I was doing both of those at the same time I think it was the final year actually of the Dave Thomas Shaw era. That sounds so official, but it was that final season where we actually obtained the rights for the Saskatchewan Huskies, the University of Saskatchewan. So what we had at that point was we actually had Rough Rider broadcasts that we were a part of the Rough Rider radio network on in Saskatoon. And then we had the Hilltop games. And then we all of a sudden had the Saskatchewan Huskies. So just to rewind a little bit, we also ran into a situation where we had me doing the Hilltop games, but also taking care of the pregame show that we ran only in Saskatoon. The Rough Riders were so popular, we actually outsold the broadcast allotment that we had for our advertisers. So we actually ran a pregame show in Saskatoon. So I took care of that for a couple of years. And the final year that I was actually doing that, I was able to get onto the sidelines. And they said, okay, you know what? You're part of our network partner. We'd really like to go ahead and expand that partnership. Why don't you come down and do visiting sidelines? I did that for 5 years, which was pretty cool. But then fast forwarding to where we were, the Saskatchewan Husky opportunity came up. And unfortunately, with the Huskies, the Hilltops, and the Blades, our company needed me not to be on TV and needed me less involved with the Rough Rider broadcasts. I strictly was doing Husky and Hilltop football at the time, which I was very fortunate to do. So I got a chance to do that for another 5 years, right? So that was where I started to learn more about doing football broadcasts, how to transform my presentation, because it's a lot different calling a football game than it is a hockey game, because you have to set up far more with formations and time on the clock and where the ball is on the field. And it's much more important because it always fluctuates when you're doing the puck is on the ice, right? That was where it really started to go up until we had the Saskatchewan Huskies. And then we actually, just coming out of COVID, had lost the rights for the Huskies. That was when, again, television came calling. And I was so fortunate because television says, hey, we need somebody that's going to do some games for us, because the guy that was doing it in Ray Morrison, he's going to be flipping and doing some radio stuff. And Dustin Nielsen, of course, was with TSN now. So I had an opportunity to take over. Well, not take over. That sounds really... That sounds bad. I had an opportunity to go ahead and do some play-by-play with Darren DuPont and the likes of Justin Dunk and Bryce McCall. There was a whole list of guys, and we do the games over the next 3 years, and had that opportunity to just have it fall into my lap again. Good time, right? Being in the right place at the right time. So I did the games on TV for Western Canada for U Sports, and of course Saskatchewan Huskies, Regina Rams, the whole gamut of it. That was where the next phase would be, if you will.
Building this resume all along, and you're getting more and more developed. And then there's the Rough Rider job coming available.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's right where it was. Here comes the Saskatchewan Rough Rider opportunity. And again, it was there, it was in front of my face, and now it was a decision that we had to face as a family, right? And the fact that, okay, I've got 2 sons that are pretty entrenched in Saskatoon, a wife who's got an amazing job in Saskatoon. We've been here for 2 decades now in Saskatoon. Is me moving to Regina, as I didn't see a way that you could do the job appropriately. And again, if a company is willing to take a chance on you, you have to show that you're willing to take a chance on them and show that mutual respect. And I didn't feel it was appropriate for me to say, well, I'll do the job out of Saskatoon, because it just, you see things at practice that make you a better broadcaster and allow you to bring more things to the table as far as your fan base, who are reliant on your eyes to broadcast that to them. The opportunity came forward, and the family, we had a discussion. And again, it was pretty straightforward from everybody, including probably the one that had the most to lose, which is my oldest son, who was in university and at the University of Saskatchewan. So if all of a sudden we up and leave, he's got to go from living in the basement and going to a class to now needing to find room and board and going to class. He looked at me, and after he went ahead and he did a number on me, because one of the things that I talk about when I coach youth, which is probably one of the big passions I have outside of work, is he said, you always tell us that you have to give yourself the tools to succeed. And then when you have an opportunity to succeed, you have to use those tools. And that was what he said to me. And he said, like, you've been talking to us about this forever. Now it's your turn to go ahead and do this, which is what we did. And like, it sounds like it was a really long conversation, but the opportunity for the Saskatchewan Roughriders in front of your eyes, it didn't take long at all.
How did that work out? Did you become aware that this opportunity was availing itself, or had you been sort of working, hoping that maybe someone would call you and say, hey, look, this is coming?
Oh, I was proactive for sure. Absolutely. And hearing that there was an opportunity again and wanting to explore it, because again, it's your dream job. And if you don't explore it, if you don't ask the question, you're never going to have the question answered. Fortunately enough for me, there were people that were willing to take my call and talk to me back and forth about the situation, as far as, hey, is this something you want to do? What would it look like? How does it look like on your end? We understand where your place is in life with being in Saskatoon as long as you have, to how would it fit for us. And again, it was a very good conversation. The biggest thing was that anyone that I talked about family first, which is kind of my big thing. And again, that goes back to Dad, right? So my dad out lining and cutting those soccer fields in Weyburn, you got to be doing it for your family first. And that was what he was doing for us back then, right? To give us an opportunity to play the sport that he loved. And this, for me, was an opportunity to go ahead and live my dream, but not go ahead and hold my family back, if you will.
Getting the job, you get to work with Luke Mullender, and you get to work in new Mosaic Stadium. What was that first experience walking into that press box? I'm the guy. I got to call this game.
Well, it's funny. The first game, I went into the wrong booth because I fortunately was actually on the call of the first ever broadcast from New Mosaic Stadium back in October of 2016. The Saskatchewan Huskies and Regina Rams were hosting a game as a test event. And they only sold the tickets in the bottom bowl. And of course, being the broadcaster for the Huskies at the time, we had an opportunity to do that game, which we did. For so many years, I've either walked into the TV booth or the visiting radio booth. Game one, I am so nervous for that preseason game because I know it's not televised. So that means that, of course, my eyes and ears are all that the fans have, in addition to TSN Plus, which I found out later because I would have been a nervous wreck had I recognized earlier on that, hey, that's going to be broadcasting on the CFL website. Anyways, I remember I took a right turn going down the hall into the broadcast booth, and I'm like, I am such an idiot. But I get there so early that nobody else knew. So I walked into that broadcast booth, and I remember Luke came in with his notes, and he's preparing vocally ready to go, and I'm sitting here, I'm like, who am I? Like, I just got a coffee, my notes and stuff. Like, I hope I'm good to go here. Worked out.
And Luke is a very genuine and affable person. He's pretty easygoing.
Absolutely. And actually, so they talked to Luke beforehand. So Luke knew before the announcement that I had been hired. From what I gather, one of the first things he wanted was my phone number because we had never connected before. We'd seen each other, of course, attending different events, so on and so forth. So he called out, and I was getting ready to take my kid to the rink and literally was making a pot of Kraft dinner on the stove. And I'll never forget it. My phone rings and it's this unknown Regina number. And I'm like, okay, I got to get my kid to hockey. Like, do I just ignore it or not? So I decided to answer, and hi, it's Luke Mullender. Hey, Dave, how are things? And I'm like, holy cow, the world stopped right there. The pot boiled over. It was terrible because I left the meal for too long. Again, that was just the start of learning who Luke is and just seeing the knowledge that he has, the respect that he gains from around the league. And again, his willingness to teach me has been outstanding. And again, I can't thank him enough for a great first year.
The first year that you went through, what was it like for you? It's a different world where you're not on a bus anymore. You're on a plane.
Oh, absolutely. It was funny because I said, somebody asked me about, I think it was probably the Labor Day rematch in Winnipeg. Someone said to me, yeah, how is the first year going? Are you settling in? And I'm like, no, like I'm week to week on everything because everything for me is a first. And that's the way I want to treat it, as a first, and not be reliant on, oh, well, I did this 2 weeks ago or I did this 3 weeks ago or anything like that. I want this to be a first. So the season was incredible in the fact that it was always a first for me. You're right. That first plane trip, we flew out of Saskatoon for a trip to Edmonton for the exhibition game. And one of those things that you just never would ever anticipate. But my father-in-law shows up and surprises the heck out of me with legendary broadcaster Brian Hall. He was insistent, hey, we're going to take you for breakfast before game number one. And I'm like, I don't have time. I have to learn what I'm doing and figure this all out. And he's like, no, you got it. You got it. Anyways, Brian Hall shows up and he shared about 45 minutes of his time with me. And I'm like, okay, I don't want to go, but I got to go. And it was just one of many firsts, like I say. And again, it's completely different from the university athletic experience because those student athletes are student athletes. Like they've got a lot going on in their world. And I don't know how there's sometimes that they juggle what they do. Whereas you come into this situation where it's professional, where this is how they make their living. This is what pays their bills. This is what makes their mortgage. And you can just see that dedication, that determination, that pure focus on the sport that I hadn't seen or had an opportunity to experience that close before.
Compare and contrast preparing for a home game versus being on the road and being prepared for that.
Well, they're two different animals entirely, because for home broadcast, what we decided to do this year is we wanted to elevate our game. And we're inspired by the NFL countdown shows, where there's a big video aspect, takes you inside the game, takes you inside the athletes, brings you closer to the community and everything that's going on. And that's what inspired our team. We undertook a video effort, which is available on YouTube. So every game at home, we actually did our full pre and post game shows as well as the halftime on video to bring that component back to what we can offer our fans and to bring an outstanding experience, which Rider Nation should expect. So we did that. for home games. And the preparation, it starts day one, just like the players, right? We're starting to build our storylines, what we're going to watch, what the statistical aspects are. We start to build that up through the week. So we get to game day, and game day for me is that I would generally arrive at the stadium 3.5 hours before kickoff. Luke will laugh at that because he doesn't know how early I'd come to home games, but 3.5 hours or so before the game, I'd show up. I'd find my roster sheets. I'd make sure that everything jived with the latest that I had as far as my statistics, the CFL statistics. Just basically, it was a backup to my backup to make sure that I was actually on point with what I needed to perform. And then we would go ahead, and an hour before the game, we would make our way down to Studio 620, right on the concourse level. We would do our portion, Luke and I, our portion of the pregame, which had generally been going on for 2 hours from there. And then we had to fight to get back upstairs, which was sometimes nip and tuck because the elevators in Mosaic can be a waiting line, let's just say. We get up to the booth, we'd usually have about 12 minutes to spare. And I say 12 minutes because we know it's about 12 minutes to spare. And then the show starts. And so, again, you're in charge of the game as it goes. The halftime you oversee and make sure things are happening. Post-game show, hustle and sprint down the stairs. Luke likes taking the stairs post-game. Don't know why. Obviously, I don't. I'm kidding. But then we do the post-game show for about an hour, and then we turn it over to the fans for their portion of the hour. For the road games, it's a little different because road games includes a day of travel. Basically, I have to have everything that I needed to do done up to the point that I would be happy with prior to leaving. We'd leave, we'd fly, we'd get where we needed to go, and we'd actually head straight to the stadium upon arrival. And that's when the visitors had an opportunity to do their meetings with our players and our coaching staff as there was a quick availability. So on the road, it was fortunate for me is that I got to go right along with the team, get to the stadium, I get to check in, and I can do some more work and get some individual interviews taken care of and any other things that I need to clean up before the game. So do that, and then that night is all about preparation. That's when my depth chart gets done. That's when everything takes course. And then the next morning of game day, I usually try to go out for a little bit of a walk. We do what's called a walk and talk on social media, and then get to the stadium. Luke and I would arrive usually about 2 hours before the game. And then, of course, we nestle in and get ourselves set to go. And about an hour before the game, we start our portion of the pregame show from the stadium and then go from there before all is said and done. Do the game. Luke goes downstairs. He's in the locker room. I'm upstairs trying to read and react to what he's doing down there. And as soon as it's done, we pack up, head downstairs, and then hop on the bus and back to the airport and home.
And when do you go home? Do you go home the next day typically?
No, that night. Usually I home that night. And it's funny because the way that the schedule would work, so I'd have the opportunity to do morning sports across the network, which I love. I absolutely love being on the radio station across Saskatchewan and Alberta every morning. And so we would arrive, for example, I could write the sports on our flight on the way home. So I would take care of that. We would land 4 o'clock, I think was the latest we ever got in from Montreal. I just drive to the radio station, take care of the morning sports, go home and get some sleep. Yeah, it's an intense schedule. But again, at the end of the day, whenever I'm thinking about it, I'm like, I'm talking sports and somebody's going to pay me for this. This is all right.
Got one of 9 jobs too, which is extra special.
Isn't it? Yeah, absolutely.
Hey everyone, my name's Steve Daniel. I'm the Associate Vice President with the CFL, in charge of football analytics, and I'm happy to be here on Third Down Gamble.
When you look back at this season and your participation in it, what do you feel you've learned, and where do you think you can take the program for next year?
Well, I've learned I earn respect. That's kind of, I want to earn somebody's respect. I don't expect anything ever to be given to me. And I was fortunate enough to build some bonds and some trust with people within the Roughriders, but also in the Canadian Football League, right? And I'm not talking about I need the inside scoop. It's just an opportunity to go and have a conversation with somebody. Those conversations I think I can better use to our advantage to bring them to the air and bring them forward much more frequently, as well as being able to be more invested in the athletes themselves, right? Like there's so many cool stories. And, you know, some of the athletes, again, it's their right to keep their personal lives personal, right? But there's so many different things that have challenged the athletes that, you know, lead up to the person that they are, not just the player that they are. And I think those cool stories are something else. And it was funny because when you're living it, sometimes you forget it. And from the outside looking in, the question that I get for the most part since the season ended was that 7-game winless stretch over the course of the summer, right? And to be honest, it didn't feel like we were in a 7-game winless streak. And the fact that, and I say we like I had anything to do with it, but we were so ensconced. Like, you look at 1 play, 2 plays, 3 plays, and that would be the maximum that changed the outcome of those games. And it's like, well, the team is right there. What do you do to push that over the hump? That's the one thing that, okay, maybe take a step back and just look at the overall picture, because when you're in it and things are going like they were in that 10-game stretch, you lose 7, it just kind of gets away from you. So next year, it won't get away from you. Trust me.
Third year in a row, this team has lost 7 in a row. Now, fortunately, this time they won at the end of that streak, where the previous 2 years they had not.
Mm-hmm.
What did that do to the team? Certainly, it took them out of the first place conversation, but what else did it do to the team?
Cemented them. It absolutely bonded them, because I think because of the layers of accountability that there were within the group, and this is just the Dave Thomas opinion, but the Dave Thomas opinion, if you look at the turning point of our season, being the Saskatchewan Roughriders, it came on September the 17th, which was 3 days before we went to Calgary. It was day 2 of preparation after the team was still in that 7-game winless stretch. They needed a win in Calgary in order to keep Calgary in the rearview mirror. And again, I don't think anybody got complacent, but Coach Mace wasn't happy with that practice on day 2. He stopped practice, called the team in, got them refocused, away they went. They go out again, and a couple of drills did not go well as far as missed assignments, missed execution. There was 2 plays in a row that happened, and that was it. He called the team in off the field, and they went ahead and they had a discussion in the locker room. It was loud. I don't know what was said, but it was loud, and that was all I could hear from down the hall. But I won't forget that the team was told the practice was over, that they were done on the field. And the leaders said, well, no, guys, we got to go and get our work in, because this is too big of a game. So the captains, the leadership group within the Rough Rider dressing room, took the team back out onto the field. They went back out. They completed what they needed to do. They went in, they did media, and then they did their meetings, and away they moved on. The next day, their practice was probably one of the sharpest practice they've had of the entire season, and they didn't look back. And I think that layer of accountability defined this group, and with nobody pointing fingers saying, well, you dropped a pass, or you jumped offside, or you took that penalty, there was none of that. And that cemented the bond that was required of this team, which I think truly made them a special group.
Sometimes, too, when you're mired in a losing streak, you can't get out of your own way.
You're right.
And maybe it takes a shake-up to just wake up.
Absolutely. And again, the Riders went this season the longest stretch of any team without a bye week in season. So they had a bye week in the preseason. They had a bye week in week number 4. And then they had to play 10 straight games, which is the longest out of anybody in the entire league, with all that travel, because they did all their Eastern trips within those weeks. So they had short weeks. They had longer weeks. Coming out of their first bye week, they just weren't sharp where they needed to be. And I think that refocus from Coach Mace, reading his team, implementing what he needed to implement as far as the accountability was concerned, turned the team and turned the corner for the team, because really they didn't look back. The only game that they lost was, and again, I don't call that last regular season game against Calgary a real loss, because let's face it, they didn't have the roster that they could have, but then they didn't lose a game again until the Western Final.
And of course, beating BC in the semifinal. They hadn't won a playoff game in a few years. That must have felt good.
That was amazing. That was absolutely incredible, because it wasn't hey, we won. It was hey, we dominated and won, because the Riders from the opening get-go were the superior team. Their preparation was better than the BC Lions that day. Their execution was better than the BC Lions that day. And I would suggest perhaps that their want and their team play was better than the BC Lions. As you could tell, it was a Lions organization that was a little bit fractured come the end of the season in all reality. But don't take anything away from the Riders, because again, they came out, they did what they had to do in front of the opponent that they had to, and I think that's a huge, huge thing for the team to do.
Going into Winnipeg in the West Final, a place that has not been kind to them in the last 5-6 years, they came close.
Yeah, but again, I think everybody will say, well, you know what? Close only counts in what? Horseshoes and manure fights. If you're close in a manure fight, you're doing okay. But aside from that, I know that the team's not going to rest on their laurels, and I had been, of course, to now Princess Auto Stadium a number of times to call university games, but I'd never been actually for a CFL game. And I didn't realize how hard that building was to play in until the West Final. And I got a brand new appreciation for it because once that momentum starts to turn a little bit, it's a runaway train in front of those fans, and full marks to Blue Bomber fans, because I remember I took my headset off at one point. Luke was talking and I wanted to just gain and allow the atmosphere to kind of take me away and see what it was actually like. And I couldn't hear Luke talking right beside me. And so again, we're not at field level where that noise is focused towards. And I'm like, this is incredible. It's a tough place to play.
That Winnipeg Stadium, the way they scallop the roof, the sound that comes out of that, the way they acoustically define that place, it's amazing. It is the best place, I think, in the CFL for that.
Absolutely. I would highly agree with that for sure. Like, again, not taking anything away because I wasn't fully aware is the wrong word, but fully appreciative of how much that noise can impact the opponent at Mosaic Stadium until I saw Vernon Adams Jr. trying to run the offense in the West semifinal, because it was loud and you could see how disruptive it was for him. But yes, definitely in Winnipeg, it is some kind of loud.
We look at the offseason, and the Roughriders have already signed Trevor Harris, although at more of an incentive-laden contract than what he's used to. Where else do you think the team is going to have to shore up to make a bid in 2025?
Shore up may not be the right term that I would use. The term that I would use is they got some really, really tough decisions that they're going to have to make. On the offensive side of the football, the receiving core is pretty good. And again, Joe will be healthy. You got Sean Bain Jr., who will be healthy. So those two coming back into the lineup are a big boost to the receiving core. A.J. Ouellette is under contract. Raquel Armstead, he is not. So what do they do in that backfield? Can they both survive, and do you have the budget for them? Offensively, what do you do with that offensive line? You had 12 bodies go through the offensive line last year. Jamarcus Hardrick will be back. We know that. We also know on the other side that you're going to have Trevor Reed at the tackle on the left side. So what happens in between? You know, Logan Furlan's there, but then you've got Peter Godber, who's a pending free agent. I know Noah Zaire has just re-signed out of Langenberg. So those decisions, again, you've got a wealth right there. What are you going to do on that side? Defensively, Anthony Lanier II, again, he can be one of the most dominant defensive linemen in the league. He brings all kinds of motivation to this group. Like he is a very vocal leader. Where does he fit in? Where does Jameer Thurman fit in? Because he was really the unsung hero in a lot of ways on that defense. Marcus Sales in the secondary. He played lights out, right? So where does he fit in? So I think there's a lot of interesting decisions that have to be made from the Riders with what they have within their building. And going back to what Jeremy O'Day, the Vice President of Football Operations and General Manager, said last year after being extremely active in the free agent period, I'd love not to be this active. That would mean that I've got guys that are here that I don't have to worry about. And I think that he's got that great problem to have right now.
Problem is you got to pay them all, and the cap is only so much.
Exactly, right? Even despite what the BC Lions might tell you. I'm kidding. I'm kidding for Lions fans. I'm joking. Yeah, no, you're right. There's only so many dollars to go around. And I'm a full proponent of players getting paid. Their careers are so short. They put their bodies and their families on hold to play the game that they love. You're right. It's an interesting balancing act, and I'm glad I don't have to do it.
Thoughts on Trevor Harris? He's not played a full season since he's been in Regina. Is he the answer for the long term, or are the Riders buying time with his contract and trying to find that other quarterback?
I think that it's all about the now with Trevor Harris, right? Because it was told to me that the legendary, the late Don Matthews apparently used to say in the CFL, there is no time to rebuild in the CFL. It's a win now league. And with the Saskatchewan Roughriders and Trevor Harris, it's win now. He was the best quarterback as far as quarterback rating goes through the second half of the season when he was playing last year. That's undeniable. What you don't get to see is just the preparation and the work that he puts in. So, for example, he was on the 6-game injured list. He wasn't able to practice. You cannot practice when you're on that list. However, he was on the sideline taking mental reps. One day I stopped him because he was holding a tennis ball in his hand. And I'm like, what's the tennis ball for? Is that just part of the rehab? So you're not holding a football? I don't understand. Can you explain it to me? And he said, actually, what happens is that I'm on film. So I can go back and I can watch and see if my timing is where it needs to be on each and every play. And by having the tennis ball, it's more identifiable. Little things like that and the level of professionalism that he brings, I think, are what sets him apart from the field, if you know what I mean.
It's a little early, but free agency is coming. And as Jeremy O'Day said, he doesn't want to be too active. We've already seen Trey Ford get pulled off the list. Do you think that there's any of the big names that are going to move, or do you think the teams are going to re-up as much as they can?
I'll be interested to see. I think Jake Mayer is going to be an interesting player to watch. Another interesting one that I think that Bo Levi Mitchell, because let's face it, it was such a love-hate relationship between him and the Hamilton Tiger Cats last year. I don't know what's going to happen there. Cody Fajardo, big off-season bonus. Does it make sense to pay that? I don't know that it does. There's a lot of people that believe that that's a slight, and I'm like, well, no, that's just that unfortunately is the reality of the game. And the players, I thought it was very unfortunate. And I had a great conversation with Luke about this. And he said, you know what, the players, they know what they're signing. They understand what they're getting themselves into. And if they can go ahead and they can secure that big offseason bonus, that's great. That's a bonus. That's what it's called a bonus for. He goes, but you also understand that you're accepting risk. And that if you don't have a good season, teams are going to be unlikely willing to pay that bonus the next year. There is obviously some risk on both sides of that equation. The other name is McLeod Bethel Thompson. It's been stated he doesn't really need to play football, but you can definitely tell he likes playing football.
Exactly. McLeod Bethel Thompson, he's been sort of off the radar with all of the Trey Ford news in Edmonton.
Yeah, well, and the only thing he didn't do last year, which is the big one, I get it, his numbers were sensational. His game management was sensational. You look at the Edmonton Elks win-loss record, and I can't say there was a game, well, that was MBT's fault. He wasn't kicking the ball out of bounds. He wasn't mismanaging the clock. He wasn't running the defense. He wasn't getting the wins either that Trey Ford did.
Chris Jones out in Hamilton, and looks like Brent Monson's going to take over as defensive coordinator. What's with that? That's
an interesting one. A very interesting one, because, again, is something else cooking somewhere for Chris Jones? I don't know, because it's undeniable the Hamilton defense was better when he came in the consultant role. Like they took their game up a level. And again, you have to give the man his props. He knows defenses in the Canadian Football League. Personnel, head coaching wise, you go ahead and be the judge on that one. Again, Brent Monson's a Hamilton guy, right? So he's coming back home. You're going to have him in the long term. But also, if I'm Scott Milanovich, am I okay with Chris Jones being behind me? Now, this is a Dave Thomas reference, right? Do I want to have a potential head coaching replacement behind me on my roster, right? A guy that's done the head coach before. So if I get up to a tough start, or if it's Bo Levi Mitchell and do we have a little bit of a disagreement at the start of the season? Who's going to go? Me or the athlete, right? And again, who knows what the inner workings were? I agree with you that it's a bit of an eyebrow raiser for sure, but in a way it also isn't as maybe Chris Jones has got something else cooking, right?
Oh, with him, you never know.
True.
Dave, where can people find and follow you on the socials? We know we can hear you on 620 CKRM.
Yeah, absolutely. _ sports Dave on X. You can find me on my Facebook page a little bit. I'm not there as active as I probably should be. And sportscage.com is our new website where you'll find a lot of the things that are happening in Riderville. And we're pretty proud of the product that we're starting to put out there each and every day, not just with the show on 620 CKRM, but like I say, on the website, all things sports, you'll find them there.
Your Sports Cage show is on YouTube too, and that's where I catch it most of the time.
There you go. Sorry about the faces. We're built for radio in a lot of ways, but no, it's a lot of fun for sure.
Hey, I've been told I got a face for radio as well. Thank you so much for doing this, Dave. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure's been mine. Thank you so much. Enjoy listening to your podcast. Thank you.
Third Down Gamble uses the expert resources of the Canadian Football League and 3 Down Nation. For up-to-date, insightful statistics and analysis, please visit cfl.ca and 3downnation.com. The CFL on CBC theme music is used with written permission from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
Thank you for listening to our show. Third Down Gamble is hosted on Podbean. Follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ThirdDownGamble. Join us again next time. The Third Down Gamble Podcast. Audio worth watching.